About the casting control adjustment on a baitcasting reel. We've been so wrong for so long. Hey, welcome back. Now today, let's begin by first taking a look at two Shimano manuals for their 2018 Bantam MGL reel. Now on the use of the casting control, the JDM manual says the casting control should essentially be adjusted to 0 in most cases. Now the North American version says the proper setting will vary with lure type and weight and line weight. So essentially, the North American version is telling us to do a traditional casting control adjustment. Now here's the question though. Why would Shimano put out two different instructions about casting control on the same reel? Now I thought Shimano must be right. So maybe the Bantam reel was produced in the middle of the infamous battle between the Ultraman and the Godzilla in Japan, where the air density and gravity were impacted so much that the brake adjustment on the Bantam in Japan has to be different from that in North America. Now, I Googled the entire internet and I just could not find any news of Godzilla and Ultraman fighting with each other in 2018. Plus, the last time I checked, Japan is still on planet Earth and it had never left the surface of Earth. Kind of baffling, right? The casting control adjustment is something that most of us learn the first day we pick up the baitcasting reel. But the debate about how it's supposed to be used has been going on forever. If Shimano could not even settle it within the company, you know this topic is far from the end. That is, until today. In the next few minutes, I'm going to break down the casting control via simple and easy experiments to settle this debate once and for all. You will be shocked the way we learned to tune it may have been wrong from day one. The casting control is basically a secondary braking system on a baitcasting reel. Now, together with the main brakes, they are both designed to control the spool overrun or the line backlash during the cast. These two brakes are actually interlinked with each other, so they must be examined together in real-world casting. The main brakes on our reels nowadays is one of the four. Now, centrifugal, magnetic, and some sort of a hybrid between the centrifugal and magnetic, and then the digital brake. And the centrifugal, represented by Shimano, and the magnetic, represented by Daiwa, are the two fundamental types of a main braking system. So we'll use these two systems for the following experiments. Now let's look at the centrifugal reels first. Now here is the Shimano 2020 Metanium, perhaps one of the most popular workhorse reels featuring a centrifugal brake. And that's also one of my favorite, by the way. Now, let me first completely turn the centrifugal brake off. Close the knobs, also turn the external dial to minimum. Then I'll adjust the casting knob so that the half-ounce casting plug is steady falling, and when it hits the ground, the spool will stop immediately by itself with barely any backlash. This is the so-called traditional casting knob adjustment, which a lot of us have used. In the first cast, I'm only going to cast gently. I'm not going to input a lot of power into the cast, so essentially just gently bend the rod and then let it out on its own inertia. My thumb did not interfere during the entire casting. No backlash occurred during the entire process. Now let me do a second cast to use more force to cast. Here we go. Now in a slow motion replay, we can clearly see there was some backlash in the early stage of the casting. Again, the main brake is completely off. Casting control is on at the traditional setting. Now please keep this in mind for now. Now next, let's continue to adjust the brakes. This time, I'm going to loosen up the casting control all the way to right before the spool is about to incur the side play. So essentially turn the casting control off. The main centrifugal brake is still completely off. Now let's make a gentle cast, similar to cast number 1. So this one we can clearly see. With both centrifugal and casting control completely off, the backlash occurred during the later section of the casting, and specifically when the lure hits the ground. Now, I also recall just now when we had the casting control on, no backlash occurred during the entire process when casting gently and specifically, there is no backlash occurring at the end of the casting. Now let's do the third test. We first go back to the setting for testing 1, where we have the casting control on, but 0 centrifugal brake. Now let's add in some centrifugal brake and see what happens. Okay, open the side plate. I'm turning on 2 of the braking pads, then adjust the external dial to between 3 and 4 settings. So basically about the medium to medium-low range for the centrifugal braking force. Now let's make a cast. This time I'm going to cast with some force. And here we go. No backlash occurs. Now recall in test number 1, when we have the same casting control setting but 0 centrifugal brake, backlash occurred in the early stage of casting. Now finally, let's do the test number 4. I'm going to turn on all the centrifugal brakes but 0 the casting control. So all 4 braking pads are on and external dial turned to max. Then adjust the casting control to 0. Let's do a gentle cast. Okay, backlash. Now when the lure hits the, and I had to intervene with my thumb, or otherwise the house wren and robin can move in immediately. Okay, so we're done with our first round of testing. What it tells us is the centrifugal brake and casting control affects different stages of the casting, or more specifically, they take care of backlash at different rates of spool rotation. In the test when we make a gentle cast, the RPM starts low and stays low through the entire process. When we make a cast with force, the RPM starts high and becomes lower and lower. So the centrifugal brake takes care of the high RPM range, or the early stage of casting. That is why in the test number 1, when we cast forcefully with the centrifugal brake at 0, backlash occurred in the early stage of casting. But when we cast gently, the RPM stayed below the range where the centrifugal brake was needed, so no backlash occurred in the early stage of that casting. Now, on the other hand, casting control takes care of backlash at low RPMs, and it's especially responsive to the sudden steep deceleration of the lure when it hits water or ground in our cases. Now this is why in test number 2 and 4, where casting control was zeroed out, both got backlash when the lure hits the ground. Now also notice in test number 4, centrifugal brake was maximum, and backlash still occurred when the lure hits the ground. Now clearly showing the centrifugal brake is not effective at low RPM. Now similarly, if we compare test number 1, the forceful cast, although we had the casting control turned to the traditional setting, but 0 centrifugal brake, backlash still occurred in the early stage of casting, indicating the casting control is not effective in the high RPM range. So this is what the Shimano centrifugal mechanism is telling us. Now what about the magnetic brakes? Here I have a 2020 Daiwa Tatula TWS. Now a very versatile all-around reel, and I really like it too. Now this reel uses the so-called zero adjuster casting control setting, where it is set at allowing the spool to have about 0.2 millimeters side play, so essentially the equivalent of just turning off the casting control in the mechanism case. But apparently, the Tatula uses Daiwa's magnetic brake. Now let's do some casting experiments just like the mechanism. I'm not touching the casting control, so keeping it at 0. Now let's start with the magnetic brake set to 10. Try a cast with some force. No thumb intervene the entire process. No backlash at all. Now let's turn the mag brake down to 8. And same thing, single hand forceful casting. Still no thumb and no backlash. Now let's try setting 7. Still no backlash. Now let's try 6. Now we start to see just a little bit of backlash at the end of the casting. And again, the casting control is the factory setting, which is 0.
Also noteworthy is model line was used on Tatula. If fluorocarbon line was used, the minimal no backlash mag brake setting will be higher than 6.
Now I'm sure you're wondering, in the centrifugal brake test number 4, when we had the centrifugal brake all the way on and the casting control at 0, the backlash still occurred at the end of the casting. But why did the magnetic brake using roughly medium setting of 8 to 10 does not have any backlash, not even when the lure hits the ground? Also, why does the magnetic brake setting affect the late backlash, or should I say affecting the low RPM backlash? Now, did we just talk about how the centrifugal brake does not work at low RPM? Yes. Now, you are absolutely right, and this is exactly the key point of this video. Magnetic brake is completely different from centrifugal brake. Although it is also a main brake, the way Daiwa designed its magnetic brake, it actually works at low RPM as well. Now this is why modern Daiwa reels can go a long way without using the casting control, but same could not be applied to the Shimano centrifugal reels. Now, what about the DC brakes and other types of brakes, such as the centrifugal and magnetic hybrid? To explain these, we need to go back to the Metanium versus Tatula test first. Now, the reason why the centrifugal brake does not control low RPM rotation is because its braking force is minimal at low RPM, regardless of the centrifugal brake setting. While the Daiwa magnetic brake have decent amount of braking force at low RPM, and this low RPM braking force increases as you increase the magnetic brake setting. So the Daiwa's main brake, the magnetic brake, actually controls both the high RPM rotation and the low RPM rotation. By adjusting the magnetic brake alone, you are not only adjusting the high RPM brake, which is needed at the early stage of your casting, but also the low RPM brake, which is usually needed toward the end of the casting. That was why for Daiwa Tatula, you can have the casting control tuned to 0 in most of the cases. Now here, the braking force of the main brake at low spool RPM is what I call the baseline braking force. If the baseline braking force of the main brake increases as you tune up the main brake setting, then this means the main brake alone will be able to control, or at least to some extent, the low RPM rotation. And you can either use 0 casting control or at least use much less of the casting control. If the baseline braking force of the main brake does not increase as you turn up the main brake setting, this means the main brake alone will not be able to control low RPM rotation. For these types of reels, you will need either casting control or more thumb feathering. Now, regardless of the type of brake, there is a pretty general and convenient way to check for the baseline braking force. Now first, zero the casting control to right before the spool starts to have the side play. Then zero the main brake and gently turn the spool. Now remember how it spins. Next, turn the main brake all the way to maximum. Gently turn the spool again and let it spin. Now if you see the spool turns much slower and the spin much less rounds at the max main brake setting, like this Daiwa Tatula, then you know the main brake is capable of control low RPM rotation, or in other words, have decent amount of baseline braking force.
This means your reel can go a long way without using only minimum amount of casting control. You can do the same thing with the 2020 Shimano Metanium. Turn the casting control to 0 and then try to spin the spool with the line on at maximum setting and 0 setting of the centrifugal brakes, and you can see basically no difference.
You can use the same method to check the reel in your hand and find out, including DC and hybrid braking systems. Now, one thing I have to mention is for DC and some of those hybrid systems, these systems could be providing minimal baseline braking force under certain settings, but above certain settings or at different modes for DC brakes, for instance, it can all of a sudden output a lot of baseline braking force. This is because different types of braking force were kicking in for some of the hybrid brakes reels, or the setting of DC brakes just completely different from the other modes. Now, for instance, in the DC case, like the A mode versus the X mode on the first generation Antares DC. Now, one more thing about the DC brake. Now, a lot of the DC settings and modes actually do need the spool to reach certain RPM before the brake will kick in. Now, we all know when DC brake is working, it comes with a trademark humming noise. Now, you can try either do a very gentle cast or just turn the spool by finger. You will notice you won't hear the trademark humming noise of the DC brake, because at low RPM, the DC brake is simply not actuated. This means for many DC settings, either casting control or thumb is still needed at low RPM or at the end of cast when the lure hits the water. So after all these experiments and explanation, I think we can now summarize the rule of thumb for casting control adjustment to this. The correct way of casting control adjustment is determined by the type of a main brake. If the main brake provides baseline braking force, minimal casting control is needed. If the main brake does not provide baseline braking force, casting control is needed. Now, either zero adjust or traditional adjust could not be fitted to all the reels nowadays because the variety of braking systems. Different reels needs to be adjusted differently and accordingly. Well, for beginners, knowing this is imperative. Now, there are a few videos essentially saying that turning off the casting control is the only right way to go. Now, imagine if a beginner turning off the casting control on his or her centrifugal brake reel and makes a cast before even know how to thumb the spool. Well, I guess this must be very good for the scissor industry. Now, for avid anglers, understanding the difference of baseline braking force of different braking systems will enable you to properly adjust the brake so as to fully release the potential of your reel and to improve your cast drastically. Now, I'll give you one example. Now, still using the Tatula, let's do a pitching test.
Now I'll start with the magnetic setting at 2. And now for this plug, I wrapped it with white foam so that you can track the trajectory during the casting. In all the following pitching tests, I'm just doing a very gentle pitch. Just notice the trajectory of this 2-setting magnetic brake. Now let's set the magnetic brake to 16, which is pretty high. And then let's take a look what happens to the pitching. Now you can see the speed of a plug is much slower, but more importantly, the trajectory of this pitching is becoming much higher than the previous one. Now for the centrifugal brake reels, you can do the same test, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to show it here. I encourage you to test it by yourself and you will find very interesting results.
For pitching, many times we want a very low trajectory to allow a still's entry of the lure into the water. But also understand, pitching is a low RPM casting, meaning the spool rotation of a normal pitching is usually in the low range compared to a forceful overhead casting and so on. Now, the trajectory is affected significantly by braking force. Now, if the force is too high, the trajectory will usually be too high. So to get a good pitching, we need to make sure that the low RPM braking force is low. Hence, for magnetic brakes, we need to tune down the magnetic brake. For centrifugal brake, because now we know the low RPM rotation is controlled by casting control and not much by the centrifugal brake, we need to pretty much zero the casting control. Now to this end, the traditional casting control adjustment on a centrifugal brake reel, which emphasizes on avoiding backlash, will restrict the casting performance significantly, and thus should not be used for either centrifugal or magnetic brake reels for the pitching cast. Now, from this example, you probably also notice that different types of casting fall into different RPM ranges of the spool. Low RPM casting and high RPM casting requires different brake adjustments respectively and on different braking systems respectively. Now, casting such as pitching, roll pitching, skipping, spiral casting, or flip cast are typically in the low RPM range, so casting control on a centrifugal reel for these types of casting will have more impact than the main brake. While overhead, sidearm, and sidearm roll cast are essentially in the high RPM range with even some small force input. So if you want to avoid backlash occurring at the beginning or middle of the cast, you need to adjust the main brake. Now, backlash at the end of the casting can be avoided by adequate amount of casting control on a centrifugal brake reel or adequate setting on a magnetic brake reel or by mastering the thumb. So to this point, we have unearthed the ultimate way to adjust the casting control on any types of baitcasting reels for almost all types of commonly used casting techniques. Now remember, any videos telling you to adjust the casting control one way or the other without taking into consideration the main brake type and the type of casting is unfortunately inaccurate. And that is why this debate has been going on for so long. As for Shimano's contradictory JDM versus US manual on the casting control, we talked about that at the very beginning of this video, our casting experiments have spoken. Now, the North America version reflects what we observe and how the centrifugal brake actually behaves in reality. So this round, North America wins. Now, in addition to what we covered today, there are a lot more questions about casting and reel left to be answered, such as how can we effectively improve casting distance, how to make the reel cast very lightweight, how to cast into the wind, how to cast accurately. Now that we have dealt with perhaps the most fundamental misconception about reel adjustment, in the next video, we will take a deep dive into those questions and show you the scientific way to cast far, to cast light, to cast into the wind, and to cast accurately. Now with that, thanks for tuning in today. Now tight lines, and I'll see you in the next one.